One day, some people said to Jesus, John the Baptist's disciples fast often, but your disciples never seem to fast. And this was just one more question that Jesus was asked by a bunch of religious people. It was right before that in Luke chapter 5 that Jesus calls Levi, who became Matthew, to be one of his disciples. And the Pharisees were really upset that Jesus would call a tax collector to be one of the disciples. And so Jesus says to them, the sick don't need a physician. Or the healthy don't need a physician, but the sick only. And so I've come to save the lost, not you who don't need a physician. And so it was this constant beret of religious Pharisees that led Jesus finally to look at them and say, look, does a man put new wine into old wineskins? No, because the old wineskins are set in their ways and they get thick and crusted and they set. And if you put new wine in and you screw the top, it's gonna burst. New wine doesn't do well in old wineskins. What Jesus was saying was, some of you think I've come to reform the system. Some of you think that I've come to pour new fresh wind and fresh fire and fresh new wine into this religion. And he's saying, I am the new wine, which demands a new wineskin. Today we're talking about the need for Reformation, the time period just prior to the Reformation period, the Protestant Reformation, 1200 to 1517. And some might ask the question, why is it that God didn't just bring Reformation and reform the established church of Europe at the time, which would have been the Roman Catholic Church? And I think the answer is because new wine doesn't go into old wineskins. And it's not just here that we see this play throughout church history. This guy's name is I think he was a game show host back in the 70s. Does it look like a game show host, right? Pastor Chuck Smith. Pastor Chuck Smith, if you've seen the Jesus Revolution movie, it tells part of his story. He's the one played by Kelsey Grammer. I was going to say Frasier. Yeah, it's the story where Frasier met Jesus. But Kelsey Grammer plays this role, Chuck Smith, who was a real pastor in California. And as a result, from his movements, started the Calvary Chapel and Vineyard movements, but he primarily the Calvary Chapels. He wrote this, and my wife sent this note to me just a few weeks ago. She was reading. Where is Heather? Is she in here? She's up there. Were you reading and were you listening to a sermon, or were you reading commentary? And it perfectly sets up the conversation today about the need for reformation. This is his quote. I do believe that when God is desiring to do fresh work, that God oftentimes has to go outside the boundaries of organized religious systems. I really don't know in history where we have any record of a true revival in denominational group. Usually, the great revivals ultimated in a whole new denomination being formed. It seems like the old skins get set, and so we see this new marvelous work of God here. He goes on, but it is my personal conviction that God had to sort of raise up new skins for the work that he was wanting to do. And so I found myself personally in that frustrating position for many years of trying to put the new wine into old wineskins. And I was just ripping things apart. Boy, what a fascinating concept. Now you think throughout church history, from the days of the persecutions of the early church all the way to the present. individuals who have felt just like this, attempting to use the old system by putting fresh wine into the old system. And he says every time he did, he's just tearing things apart. I was known as a rebel, a nonconformist, and every other thing that could be said because I could not see going along with just the traditional things of the denomination. Why, Chuck Smith says, don't we just get back to the Word and follow the Word of God? And it just seemed so simple enough. But the old skins just can't handle that. They're already set in their ways. He ends the quote by saying, there are many people today who are still involved in the process of carefully pouring new wine into old wineskins, always trying to pour it in such a way that we don't split them carefully, quietly, so they don't burst them. But ultimately, people come to the conclusion that it's not an easy thing to do if it is possible at all. This is the repeatable story over and over and over throughout 2,000 years of church history. And one of the most notable events culminates in a moment where a Roman Catholic monk takes a list of grievances and he pounds them into a wall in Germany. Today we're going to talk about the lead up to the Reformation, 1200 to 1517. AD 1200 to 1517. And we begin with that point number 1 in your notes, the need for Reformation. And underneath, we're going to talk about the all-encompassing power of the medieval Roman Catholic Church. Now, that's important what I just said there, the medieval Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is such a large and historic institution. To just classify it as the Catholics is doing a disservice to history. What Roman Catholicism is today is not what it was then, and what it was then was not what it was 400 years before, and what it was 400 years before that was not what it was in the 6th century. So we're talking specifically about the medieval Roman Catholic Church, the all-encompassing power. By the time you get to AD 1200, the Roman Catholic Church was all-encompassing in its power. Political and religious leaders were the same. So wherever you lived, your religious leader was a politician, and your politician was a religious leader. So the civil government and the religious institution were so intertwined, they had complete and utter dominion over the individual. They were caretakers for the eternal soul. In a group of individuals that could not read, the vast majority of Europeans during this time, and wherever the Roman Catholic Church had spread at this point, they were illiterate. So the thing that they had to do is trust their political leader, their religious leader, that they had done everything that they needed to do in a book that they could not read. And the problem is that humans are humans, and power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And when these individuals were in a place of absolute supreme power, many of them, some of them we're going to study today, were good people. Many of them allowed that power to corrupt them, and in doing so, hold this concept of caretaker of the eternal soul over the eyes or over the heads of the people. And in doing so, what a tragic situation we see. Then we have the parish priests. The number one authority in most people's lives, if you were to travel back in time throughout Germany, England, France, Spain, anywhere around the Mediterranean, even Northern Europe, North Africa at this point, all the way out through this entire Turkey and North, the parish priest was the authority. Understand, the parish priest baptized you. They heard your confessions. They married you. They provided your last rites. Social services, those all went through the parish priest. They provided your education. And they were the only guy in town who could read the Latin Bible. If, in some cases, they could not. If, in some cases, which in some cases they could not. So this individual was truly powerful. Now, we think to ourselves, well, I mean, wouldn't it be awesome if it was just like one person who is just supremely good, and that supremely good person had all the power in the world? And the answer is no, unless that one person is the very Son of God named Jesus Christ, and he is the one who is prophet, priest, and king, and he should one day have complete and total dominion over all things. This is a major issue, and it leads to the all-encompassing power of the medieval Roman Catholic Church. Number 4 there, they also owned 1/3 of all the land in Europe by the 12th century. 1/3. Think about that. 1/3 of all land belonged to one institution. And so we see the beginning point tonight, this idea of all-encompassing power, yes, belonging to the Roman Catholic Church. But number 2, I want to talk about the medieval Inquisition. Now, don't confuse this with the Spanish Inquisition that's going to come in next week's session. I believe we're going to get there. But the medieval Inquisition had to begin because though they had all-encompassing power, they could not control the minds and the hearts of the people. And again, there were some good people here. We're going to point them out in a moment. For example, Francis of Assisi and others. But the vast majority were corrupt, as we have pointed out. And though there was complete control, they could not control the hearts and the minds of the people. And in doing so, there were fragment groups that called themselves Christians that started to bubble up. And they had been bubbling up. They had been bubbling up all the way back to the time of the Apostle Paul. They had been bubbling up even in the early 4th and 5th and 6th century. You had groups that would not conform to the one universal church. And during this time, there were 2 groups that really stand out. First of all, the Albigensians. And then number 2, we're going to talk about the Waldenses. The Albigens were a separatist group from Albi, France. It was a group that spread rapidly. Don't think of them like a small fringe church of 150 people. No, like this was massive groups of people all over. Started in Albi, France. That's why they're referred to as the Albigensians. And it spread throughout the entire. Now, what's most fascinating about them, well, there's lots of things they're fascinating, but what's notable about them is they considered themselves Christians, and they were not they would not conform to the Roman Catholic Church. They would not go to the state-run and state-sanctioned church. Now, imagine what that'd be like. In Las Vegas, you could go to church, and if you're from China, you would understand this. I have friends that minister in China, and if you don't go to the state-sanctioned church, you're not allowed to go to church. You're not allowed to. And so this is exactly where Europe was during this time. And so there were many Christians who said, I don't want to go, so I'm not going to go. And they would go to these house churches, and they would pay dearly for it. We'll see this to be the case. Now, there were 2 groups. First of all, the Albigensians and the Waldensians. But the Albigensians, let's talk about them first and foremost. They were a group that believed in Jesus, but they had an odd theology. For example, they believed in 2 gods. They believed in the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. They still called themselves Christian. We're going to only talk about Christians at this point for this session, but they had some odd beliefs. They believed the God of the Old Testament was evil, the God of the New Testament was good, and they battled themselves back and forth. We would call that, is that true doctrine, yes or no? No, that's not true doctrine. We call it heresy. So are these heretics, yes or no? Yes, these are heretics. Nonetheless, they were those who stood against Roman Catholic control, and so we can relate to them on that level. They did not believe, they were heavy into old Gnostic superstition. They did not believe anything of the physical realm was good. For example, they did not believe that Jesus had a physical body. They did not believe in physical sacraments. They rejected the physical church building. Anything that was physical, they were against, because everything that was physical was evil. Evil was physical, spiritual was good. Remember, this is old Gnostic concepts. Albigensians bought into much of this. But again, why do we bring them up? Because they were a very fast-growing group during this time who rejected Roman Catholic control, and therefore we would relate on that level. By the way, this is interesting. If anybody comes from, anybody ever heard of the little pamphlet, Trail of Blood? Okay, So this is a Baptistic booklet. Now, there are some good aspects of that booklet, but the booklet itself has a lot of misinformation. And some of the misinformation relates to the Albigensians and the Waldensians and the Paulicians. These are groups of people who rejected Roman Catholic control, and therefore we can understand where they're coming from, but they also had a lot of false doctrine we would never claim. And so they're not like, oh, that's like us. I'd be an Albigensian if I... No, that's not true at all. The Waldensians are also like that. They were called the followers of Peter Waldo. They came from Lyon in France, and a lot of growth here. These individuals believe the Bible to be the only authority for faith and life. So that's very much like we believe. They were pacifists. They would not allow their followers to join the military, fight in any way. They would not allow them to be involved in civil politics. They were committed to poverty. They would have what we would call a poverty theology, just as today there's a prosperity theology. If God really loves you, you'll be rich. They had a poverty theology, that is, give away all that you can. And we're going to see a lot of reformers had some of that philosophy, primarily because of the excesses of the Roman Catholic Church during the time. There was such pomp, wealth, and crazy excessiveness with the Roman Catholics. There are many reformers who swung the pendulum all the way over to the opposite end, and they walk around without shoes and poverty-stricken. We're going to see that. Informal, they believed in informal worship rather than formal worship. How many of you grew up in a church that followed a liturgy? You know what a liturgy is? A liturgy is a very specific set of Sunday worship structure, right? Stand up, sit down. How many of you grew up with and ours seems more like like a show, right? Okay, so one is a liturgic church, and liturgic churches would be Roman Catholic, of course, Anglican, Episcopalian. They would be Lutheran. And anybody else? Any others that you want to throw out there? How many of you grew up in a church like this? Raise your hand. How many of you? Okay. So there's always been pushback against that by certain groups of people that believed that worship services were to be more casual and more relaxed. And so they believed in informal worship. They also believed in men and women preachers. So the Waldensians were complete egalitarians 800, 900 years ago, fascinatingly enough. So now, why am I bringing this up? We're talking about the medieval Inquisitions and the hyper control of the Roman Catholic Church. There were groups of individuals who rose up. Some were the Waldensians, some the Albigensians. These are just samplings. And these groups grew rapidly. Remember, tell humans they're not allowed to do something, and they will ask you, where and when am I not allowed to do it, right? And they will find a way to do what you told them not to do. And so the Reformation just exploded under the radar at first. Now, I want to bring up the Dominican and the Franciscan friars at this point, because the Dominican and the Franciscan friars were two, and I'm summarizing if you know this history, there were two orders of priests/monks that were established during this time, specifically and intentionally, because the Waldensians and the Albigensians were growing so rapidly. They were spreading across borders, and these Reformation groups were growing so fast that somebody needed to stand against it. So these two orders were established. Now, I do not believe the Franciscan order was established to combat, but they were used very strongly by the Roman Catholic Church to combat these specific groups. And because there was an unholy alliance between the church and the state at the time, these Franciscans and the Dominicans, they would go in and they would find out what somebody taught, and then they had the ability, the legal ability to do arrests. They didn't call it arrests, but literally detain them until the quote unquote civil authorities could arrive. Then they would report them to the civil authorities. The civil authorities would then take them and burn them at the stake. So the Dominicans and the Franciscans did not literally burn other Christians at the stake. they were the ones who would be like the spies, the agents, the FBI, who would come in and find out who you were and then turn you over to the people who would do so. So we call this the Albigensian Crusades. The church did not attempt to, at this point in history, go after the Holy Land all the time. Now they turn their attention going after anybody who would be heretical in their mind. So I don't believe in heresy. I don't think people should be heretical, but I also don't think you should burn them at the stake for being heretical, right? This is true. I hope some of you agree. Let's move on. Throughout this, there was an individual that rose up that I admire named St. Francis of Assisi. And he is a fascinating individual who was extremely popular during the 12th century. And he, I believe, we would call him, I would refer to him as a pre-reformer. Before the Reformation actually began, he was somebody who is not a typical Roman Catholic priest, who probably could have been an actual true believer. And he demonstrated that by his lifestyle. Witnessing the extremes of the Roman Catholic wealth and corruption, Francis vowed to live a simple life of poverty as a traveling preacher. And he was a well-known traveling preacher. Think Billy Graham of his day. And so he traveled around. His special affinity for nature and animals is why we often see him surrounded by birds and small animals in his depictions. His followers established the Franciscan order. So the Franciscan order actually comes from the name St. Francis or Francis of Assisi. During the Fifth Crusade, this is really interesting if you've ever traveled to the Holy Land. If you've ever traveled to the Holy Land and you see that there are churches that date back 800 years that have never moved, and it's always their big sign on top that says run by the Franciscan order. You say, well, how did they get here? When did they get here? And the answer is right here. It was during the Fifth Crusade when we've only studied up to the Fourth Crusade, and we're going to leave those behind because they get kind of boring. It was during the Fifth Crusade that Francis got special permission to actually travel ahead of the warriors to go to Egypt. And when he went to Egypt, he wanted to meet with the Sultan for the sole purpose of having a dialogue about Christianity and Islam. And his goal was to convert him to Christianity, or at least give him an opportunity to realize you don't want to kill us and we want to kill you. And in doing so, long story short, Francis was able to broker a deal where they were able to get control, not of the Holy Land as a whole, but of the holy sites. So it wasn't just the Franciscan order 100 and 200 years later that got a hold of the holy sites. It was actually St. Francis himself going in and say, this spot is really important to us. Can we have this? You think about that. That is after 200 years of war and crusades that they would say, okay, you know what, you can. This is why we Christians have Bethlehem. This is why we have, I wrote them down because I always forget the list, but we have the Via Dolorosa, the Upper Room, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The reason the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is there and has lasted for 800 years is because of the Franciscan order. And because specifically, not just the order, but because of him specifically. And so fascinating. Okay, now, why do I go out of our way to say this, by the way? Because I think it's important to be fair throughout Christian history and not just highlight people who might fall into my faith stream of history. This was a very, very good man and a fascinating leader. Let's go on to John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was also a Roman Catholic bishop, a priest, I should say. And now, why are we going on to him? Remember, don't lose the storyline here. There's a need for reformation. Why? The RC is completely corrupt and in total power at this point. I should say completely, incredibly corrupt and really powerful. We see the medieval Inquisition that's beginning to take place because all these groups are rising up all throughout Europe. And out in England, jolly old England, there's a man named John Wycliffe who rises up. And John Wycliffe is a fascinating individual. We refer to him as the morning star of the Reformation because really he was the beginning. We think of Martin Luther, but there is no Martin Luther without 200 years before a man named John Wycliffe doing what he did 150 years before. He was a Catholic priest. and professor of the University of Oxford, who displayed independence of thought and loyalty to Scripture. Fascinating about him is he would actually maintain his professorship and keep teaching it at Oxford while speaking against the Roman Catholic Church. In the 14th century, this is scandalous, and everybody wanted to hear what Wycliffe had to say. Now, is it also true that England was beginning to want to spread its independent wings? Sure. Is it true that later on there would be a big fat king who wanted to kill some wives and take control of the future of England outside of Rome's power? Of course. But this is hundreds of years before this. Fascinating that this man was able to accomplish this. He addressed the power of the Roman Church over England and really preached this. His point, this guy was brilliant because though he was godly, and I believe a true believer and a biblicist, the fascinating thing about Wycliffe is he understood how to use the political dynamic of the day to promote religious freedom and to advance his own nation. So he rallied people around the idea of, why is Rome in control of us? And so 150 years before, King Henry VIII is like, yeah, that's true. I want a new wife. John Wycliffe was kind of sowing the seeds of independence already. He attacked transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is the Catholic dogma that when you partake of the bread and you eat it, it literally, not figuratively, not symbolically, but literally becomes the body of Christ. When you drink the cup, it literally becomes the blood of Christ. Some would say semantics. Wycliffe said that's false. That's not true. The church had not always taught this. Why did we change? So he taught against that. He attacked the false doctrines of monasticism, the sacraments as that which pertains to grace, veneration of saints, and the papacy. He even called the Pope the Antichrist. He was the first famous person to do so. Luther would say much worse. Next week when we talk about Martin Luther, Luther would say so many things that I cannot say from this platform. Luther was very bold, blunt, and vulgar. Honestly, he was quite a guy. Okay, so John Wycliffe, fascinating man. He also was the person who translated the Latin Vulgate in 1386. It was the first English Bible. So why are we bringing all this out? Because we speak English. This is our history. The first English Bible translated from the Latin Vulgate in AD 1386. This will come up later. This is important. It was the first English Bible. Say first English Bible. First English Bible. Translated from what? Latin. That's important later because sometimes that gets confused with the other English Bibles that are to come. So was the Bible originally written in Latin? Yes or no? No. It was translated from Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin by Jerome. We talked about him. He was back in the 4th and the 5th century. So then this guy, Latin Vulgate is what's known, so he takes what is known and he translates into English. And his whole explanation was, we need a Bible that can be understood in the common language of the vulgar, the common man. It was him who originally stated this concept of, we need a Bible that the plowboy in the field can understand. Why is it that but the argument at that time was, why would you take the high language of Latin, the language of God, and bring it down to the common man? You need to elevate the common man to understand the language of God, which is just, basically a bunch of baloney wrapped inside of tradition, wrapped with a bow to say, we don't want to change. And so Wycliffe pushed, and he tried to pour some new wine into those old wineskins. His followers were called the Lollards, and they were traveling evangelists, is what they were. I'm simplifying, but that's exactly what they were. He trained his own young priests outside of the system, and then he sent them into the fields and into the villages to preach the exact opposite of Roman Catholicism. And it was interesting because these guys have a direct link. The people they ended up influencing were John Huss. They traveled outside of England. They traveled all throughout Europe, the Lollards did. Eventually, their teachings influenced John Huss down in the Czech Republic, modern day Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia. John Huss was the guy who influenced Martin Luther. So you see a direct line from Martin Luther to John Wycliffe, and fascinating. I was about to say, I don't know if you're fascinated. I am, but you're here on a Tuesday night, so I guess you're fascinated by it too. All right. So let's talk about John Huss, because John Huss was of Prague, and I call him the influencer of the Reformation. So if Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation, John Huss was the influencer. He was brilliant. He was the mind you wanted on your side. He taught that one could be in the church and not a true member of the church. Was he the only person teaching this? No. We already talked about the Waldensians and the Albigenses and all the other, quote unquote, from the Roman perspective, heretical people. There are lots of people who believe this, but he was the first of grand importance and of note in modern Europe at the time to say, you can be a member of the church, but not actually part of the church of God. And this shocked the typical Roman Catholic. What are you talking about? I'm not part of the church of God. My parents are. What are you talking about? I got baptized. What are you talking about? I did the confirmation thing. Yeah, but you don't even know anything about Jesus. You don't follow him, and you don't understand any doctrine, and you live your life like you're a devil. Yeah, but I'm in the church. And his whole message was, you could be in the church, but you're not in the church. By the way, is that possible for somebody to be in the church and not in the church? Yes. And that's true of Roman Catholics. It's true of Baptists. It's true of Calvary Chapelites. It's true of every denomination that has risen up and grown up throughout Christianity, throughout all history. And so John was trying to say, no, you cannot believe this. So Christ alone, he taught, and not the popes or cardinals, was the head of the church. That was revolutionary as well. He said the head of the church is Christ. Now you say, isn't that what was written in the Bible? Yes, but people had already got to the place, so the Roman Catholic Church had got to the place where they had elevated tradition up to the same level as the Bible. And in doing so, you could literally argue, yes, that's what the Bible says, but... And so that's why during the Reformation, the establishment of the five solas came to be, sola scriptura being chief among them. That is, we only trust what only is in only the Bible, right? It's what does the Bible say? That's what matters. Modern American Christians say, what does the Bible say? What does the Bible say? What does the Bible say? I don't care what your opinion is. I don't care what your tradition is. What does the Bible say? Show me from the Bible. And so John Huss was part of that. Preaching against indulgences, he was threatened with excommunication. Oh, by the way, I like this quote from him. Oh no, that's somebody else. Preaching against indulgences, he was threatened with excommunication, promised safe travel conduct to the Council of Constance to answer for his heretical crimes, and he stated at his trial, I would not for a chapel of gold retreat from the truth. Now think about this. He was put on trial for teaching what the establishment considered false doctrine. And he said, I will not change what I believe, not for a chapel of gold. He was burned at the stake while singing the Psalms. In his final words, he predicted that God would raise others up who would protest the Roman Catholic Church and call for further reform. If you go to Prague today, you can see this statue dedicated to a man who would not waver. By the way, how much did they hate this guy? This guy died 100 years before this. When the persecutions of Protestants started, the Roman Catholic Church dug up his bones and burned his bones, and then took the ashes of his bones and threw them in the closest river. So I don't know if that hurt him, but that was him. Thomas-a-Kempis, some do not qualify him as a reformer. I do. I think Thomas-a-Kempis, he never left the Roman Church, but neither, by the way, did Martin Luther. He was excommunicated. And none of these guys, most of these guys remained in the Roman Catholic Church the rest of their life, attempting to reform it as they protested it. It's their followers that had nothing to do with it because they were excommunicated. They're not allowed to be part of it. But Thomas-a-Kempis, he's the one who wrote Imitation of Christ. Anybody here ever read Imitation of Christ? It is a classic piece of Christian literature, very much worth your time. But he was preaching against the excesses of the RC as well. If you want to learn, he said something that will really help you. Learn to see yourself as God sees you and not as you see yourself, in a distorted mirror of your own self-importance. He taught much about humility, and he is a fascinating read if you're ever interested. Then there's Erasmus. Again, we're talking about all the people who predated the beginning of the technically predate the Reformation. Erasmus was from the Netherlands. Notice all of these leaders from all over Europe at this point. I believe he was the intellectual with tough questions. That's what I call him. And the RC priests wrote extensively on the ignorance of modern monks and the extensive corruption of the church in his, this RC priest, Erasmus, he wrote extensively on the ignorance of the modern monk, the extensive corruption in the church. See, his problem was even the monks in the monasteries had gotten to the point that they were so deluded in their own mindset that they had become less academic, and they weren't actually students anymore like they had been three to 4 centuries prior. So he's so livid, the fact that these people don't even understand what they're talking about. They barely read Latin, and you don't understand what the scripture is. So he wrote a book called In Praise of Folly, which historically, again, is a very important book to Christian faith. To Protestants anyway. As a Latin and Greek scholar, he ended up editing the Greek New Testament, for which we received the Tyndale Bible for the printing of the first English New Testament directly from the original Greek. So how did we get our Bible, the Bible you have? The way we have it is not through Wycliffe necessarily. Remember, he translated from the Latin. It was through this guy. Erasmus translated Erasmus, who was a Greek and Latin scholar, translated the Bible so that William Tyndale could use his Greek New Testament and then create the first English Bible. Tyndale would eventually, by the way, was the precursor to the King James Version of the Bible, which had been the gold standard for almost 400 years of church history. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about these crazy people, the Anabaptists. This is where this church finds its lineage, the Anabaptists. Anabaptists, who are these? These were Baptists who all named their daughters Anna, Anabaptists. Never mind. Anabaptist means rebaptizers. They were known during this time of the 16th century, 15th and 16th century, that if you came out of the Roman Catholic tradition, that they would rebaptize you into one of their churches. This was different than all of the other reformers, and they predate their history beyond the reformers, many of them drawing their lines back to other segmented groups, such as the Waldensians. Anabaptist was not a name they created for themselves. They did not put a sign on the front of their church, First Anabaptist Church of Prague. That's not how it worked. They were called Anabaptists because they were Anabaptizers, rebaptizers. And everybody hated the Anabaptists, especially the RCs, but everybody hated the Anabaptists. The Lutherans hated the Anabaptists. The Calvinists hated the Anabaptists. Everybody hated the Anabaptists because no matter where you came from, they're like, do you believe in Jesus? And they're like, yes, good, let's get baptized. But I was already baptized. All the other churches were okay with the fact you were baptized as a child because they believed baptism was covenantal, not salvific. Or I should say, they believed it was covenantal and salvific, and it was not symbolic. The Anabaptists believed baptism was symbolic, therefore needed to happen after salvation. This is one of the beliefs that we have that come from Scripture, and we believe that they recognize the same truth that we recognize, the Anabaptists. It all began with the Anabaptists, again, it's simplistic to say it all began with, but a simplistic view of Baptist history is there was a guy named Conrad Grebel, who was led to Christ in Zurich by a Swiss reformer named Zwingli. Say Zwingli. You'll hear about him next week. I know he's not one of the more popular reformers, but he's incredibly important from Switzerland. And Zwingli was the one who actually led Conrad Grebel to Christ. He began to lead home small groups and start home churches Why didn't he go out and build the building and just build a church? Because it was illegal to do so. And so he began to start small groups everywhere. One of his converts eventually asked to be rebaptized, and since he had been recently born again, and Griebel complied. So those who study Baptist history will point back to this as definitive. So we have a Roman Catholic convert who got saved, who wants to be baptized because he sees in Scripture baptism as a ordinance after salvation, and this guy rebaptizes him. Were they the only groups to do this throughout history? Of course not. There were many groups that did this throughout history. They were just small in comparison and did not lead to the domino effect that we see Griebel's did. The Anabaptists really fought against church and state, the merging of church and state. Baptists are not only known, and they would be for the next 500 years, they're not only known, well, now they're known for all sorts of weird stuff, but Baptists historically have not only been known as being re-baptizers, they're also known as the ones who fight for the separation of church and state. Now, we live in an era where we hear the exact opposite, but that's not historically what Baptists have been. The reason Baptists have fought against church and state, I'll give you an example. Name throughout history the state or the city or the nation that was a Baptist nation. Name it. Don't say Texas. Close, but not really. All right. Name one. It's not there. At the same time, name a country that was Anglican. Right. Name a city that was Calvinist. Geneva. Name a state that was Catholic. Italy. France. Name a state that was Lutheran. Well, Germany, obviously, and all the different subgroups before the unification of Germany. They had official state religions. They were merged. And this all began all the way back in the Roman time when Rome, back when Constantine declared Christianity legal. Remember, we said there was an unholy merger of the state and the church that came together. And the Pantheon in Rome is a perfect example of this. If you go to this place, this is modern photograph. If you go to the Pantheon and you go inside, this is an old Roman temple converted during the time of Constantine into a Christian church. When it did not, the deed did not go to a group of people. Who owns this building? The answer is the congregation owns this building. Legally, our documents say that we are congregational, run. The congregation owns it, and we're represented by 5 board members who are selected from the congregation. There is no denomination or state who owns this building. We own this building. Who owned this building before Christianity? Rome. Who owned this building after it was turned into a church? Rome. Do you see? The merger of the state and the church. So now what you have, and that wasn't necessarily a nefarious thing for the first 150 years, but it became a nefarious thing because, again, the conglomeration of power of state and church together means that you have the potential for a lot of corruption. When Rome Christianized their empire, the vast majority of Romans were now seeing themselves as Christian due to the empire's shift in religious loyalty. Do you get it? So as soon as the emperor says, we're all Christian now, some random farmer's like, we're what? I like Zeus. No? We like who? Jesus? Okay, we like Jesus. And he goes back to farming. Is that person a Christian? Yes or no? No. But this was the problem. This is the problem with state-sanctioned. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, but the primary problem. Furthermore, during the Protestant Reformation, when a city council or royal priest joined the Reformation movement, all of the citizens were suddenly considered Protestant Christians. It wasn't just the RC who did it. It was the Protestants who did this. Do you understand? So suddenly Geneva is like, we're no longer Catholic. And the average citizen's like, we're no longer. The barber, think of the barber, right? The barber's in there, Floyd's cutting hair. And he's like, so we're not Catholic anymore? They're like, no, we're Protestant. He's like, all right. And so he just keeps cutting hair. Is the guy a Christian? No. But now he no longer has to pay tithes to Rome. He has to pay tithes to John Calvin's pocket. Do you see? So from the very beginning, Baptists were like, no, there should be no state-sanctioned, state-merged church. There should only be free, independent, autonomous churches that are left the heck alone by the church, by the state. Leave us alone. Let us do our thing. Don't tax us, and let us alone. That's the position. You say, I believe that. Well, maybe you're Baptist. The Anabaptists insisted that membership in the church was limited to those who consciously committed themselves to Christ. So they believed you are not a member of the church simply because you were born in a certain state, right? Like my family's from Lebanon, and Lebanon was a Christian country before Hezbollah took over. And it was just known in the region, if you were from Lebanon, especially certain cities, you were Christian, you're a Christian family. So my grandfather was Christian, but then when he came to the United States and he found out what it meant to be converted to Christianity, later on in his life, he became a true Christian. There's a difference. And those of you who understand cultural Christianity will understand this to be the case. But there's this idea that nationality equals faith. Your nationality does not equal faith. One could not be a member of the church via their national identity. All right, separation of church and state. So they fought for this. Heresy became a crime to be punished by the state with great severity. Do you see the problem? So now, if you murder somebody, the state's going to get you. But if you commit heresy, the state's going to get you. What? So that guy stole that guy's horse, and I said that there are two gods, and I'm going to die alongside the guy who stole a horse? Why? Because the guy in charge is in charge of doctrine as well as horses. Do you see the problem? And it's hard for us to see the problem because we've never lived under that corruption. Or some of us may, I don't know your background, some of you may have come from places that, in modern day Middle East, this is the problem with a theocracy. Christians in America that forget our history, we hear things like theocracy and we're like, that'd be a good idea. No, you do not want to live in a theocracy. You say, well, I mean, if they believed everything I believe, when was the last Christian you met that believed everything you believed? No, freedom of religion is what you want, and you want to fight and die so that everybody who doesn't believe what you believe can believe exactly what they want to believe. It's the safest thing for you and your children and your grandchildren. Nonetheless, we got to move on. Anabaptists, distinctions. Here are their distinctions. They got burned a lot. That's what happened. Theologically, they aligned with Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and the other reformers, yet they had their own peculiarities. The Anabaptists, some people say, I'm Baptist, so I'm just like the Anabaptists. No, the Anabaptists believed in some good things and some odd things. They stressed returning to the precepts of the first century church. That's good. Church membership was restricted to saved persons. That's good. And they refused infant baptisms. That's good. Again, according to my position. They believed strongly in communal living and sharing earthly goods. So they were communal. They forced communalism, which is also called. Sure. In Switzerland, they were known as the Swiss Brethren. The Swiss Brethren, by the way, is a good denomination that's still around to this day. If you ever hear somebody say, I go to a Brethren church, they go back to this movement of Anabaptists. In the Netherlands, they were known as the Mennonites. You ever heard of the Mennonites? Yeah? Okay. And in Alberta and Manitoba, they are known as the Broederhoffers, or the Brother Estate, even to this day. Anabaptist persecution, I already mentioned it. In the mid to 16th century, in the mind of the 16th century Catholic, to refuse infant baptism was tantamount to damning the soul to hell. Now think about this for a moment. Why would these people, what is the motivation behind these people taking this preacher and throwing him into the fire? Like, these people were just crazy. They could not think. No, they were all thinkers. They weren't stupid. In the minds of these people, this guy is refusing children the chance to be baptized. And in a society where the infant mortality rate is high, this person is not only letting children die, this person is sending them to hell forever. Forever. We get riled up because there are human babies who are killed physically. These people are riled up because this guy's sending people to hell forever. babies. You see? So the leaders of the populace are stirring up the embers to get rid of these people who are bringing genuine, true theological change that is turning the entire nations upside down. So you can see what's going on here. Also, their socialistic tendencies and refusal to cooperate with the state-sanctioned churches pointed them as revolutionaries and dangerous. They were imprisoned, fined, drowned, tortured, and burned at the stake by Catholics, Lutherans, Zwinglies, and Calvinists. Their crimes included refusal to pay tithes to the state church, attend state churches, holding unsanctioned home churches, and preaching heresies. So these are the things you could be burned at the stake for. And now we're trying to talk Christians into starting their own home Bible study, right? We're like, please start a home Bible study. And you didn't want to do it back then. Okay, this leads us to the Mennonites and the Amish. The reason I just point these out at this time is these are descendants of this Reformation. We won't be touching on them later on, so I'm just mentioning them now. There was a guy named Menno Simons, Menno Simons, a Dutch reformer and moderate Anabaptist, and he was a moderate, a true moderate. I think he was a really great leader in church history. He traveled broadly throughout the Netherlands and Germany as a traveling pastor / evangelist. They were peaceful, industrious, prosperous, and commonly respected, even among unbelievers and even among other reformers, and even among Roman Catholic communities. Jacob Ammon fell, so that was the Mennonites. And the Mennonites are around to this day, of course. Then there's the Amish. Jacob Ammon felt that shunning of the excommunicated members was a biblical command found in 1 Corinthians 5, while others felt that this applied primarily to the Lord's Supper, which is what I believe. After splitting from the Swiss Brethren, the followers of Ammon established a rigorous religious church lifestyle that demands a unique adherence to traditional 18th century way of life, and this is where the Amish come from. All right, very good. That leads us to the Protestant Reformation itself, and we're just touching on the Protestant Reformation. That's what we'll be talking about next week. So, the Protestant Reformation. I point to two primary false doctrines, though the RC at this point had a lot of false doctrines. I believe that there were two primary that broke the back of traditional Roman Catholicism. The first was purgatory and penance. The second was indulgences. Purgatory and penance. Through baptism, the Eucharist, confession, the atonement for the sick, the seeker could obtain absolution from sins and their penalty. Penance. The idea was if you do these 4, 5, 6 things, you've started to pay down your bill. So if you owe God 1,000 for your sins, if you do this, you only owe $9.99. And you do this, you only $9.98. It was a bartering system. From an outsider's perspective, it was a bartering system, and it was oppressive. And the reason is because of the hyper power of the parish priest. He could at any moment cast down on somebody, you have this many more sins, you owe this much more penance. And so from the parish all the way, the little villages, all the way to the main urban center of Rome, it was a major problem. And so hell was constantly held over the heads of the believer. You're going to go to hell, 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 you're going to go to hell. And people just got tired of it. So penance, if the priest felt that you were truly contrite, then you'd be granted forgiveness and you'd perform spiritual duties like prayers, fasting, giving alms, pilgrimage to a shrine, and participating in a crusade. So again, it was subjective. If your parish priest thought and felt you were sincere, then he would say, okay, what I need you to do is do 3 prayers, and I need you to give this much, and it was really bad, so I need you to do a pilgrimage, and if we got a crusade going on, I need you to go on the crusade too, because we got a new crusade going on, and our village needs to send 40 people, so I got a quota, and you're really screwed up, you don't want to go to hell, so go. And so it was a big problem. It was a big problem. By the way, penance and purgatory were not traditional Roman Catholic beliefs just 200 years previous to this. These were new doctrines created. I don't know if that's fair. They were used to control the populace. The other was indulgences. If one had money, he could skip the inconvenience of penance and simply purchase forgiveness. Isn't that nice? Like if you have enough money, you don't even have to go on a crusade or these things. All you got to do is pay us. Just let me dip my beak in there just a little bit, and you'll be fine. You go to heaven. You're good. So it was very corrupt. I'll talk more about this tomorrow or next week, but this is where the well-known evangelist named Tetzel, not Pretzel, now I'm hungry. Tetzel was commissioned by Leo X, and he was a very gifted salesman. He was a Dominican friar, and he was sent out from Rome to travel specifically throughout Germany. And as he traveled throughout Germany, he would sell as many indulgences as possible. He was a very gifted speaker, so he could talk anybody into spending all sorts of money. And his famous poem or quote was, the moment the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And so he would just like twist these poor people into giving their last dollars so that grandma or grandpa does not burning in hell. And his stories would be about people burning in purgatory and dying and suffering, and they're calling out your name, and all you have to do is give $50 more. And this is all because the Vatican had to be built. St. Peter's had to be finished. And Leo was feeling the pressure, and so he's putting the pressure, tightening the screws on the sales guy. The sales guy's out there talking to, and you know who this really made mad? A very serious priest named Martin, who took it very seriously. And he saw this scam, and he's like, this is not going to fly. So that leads us to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a confused young German monk. Studying law at the University of Erfurt, Luther found himself caught in a thunderstorm. So he was a law student. His dad actually was not wealthy, but he had worked like a dog to put him through law school, and he had even graduated with his master's degree in Erfurt, and he was on his way to becoming a truly successful, powerful man in Germany. And which I understand, because I have a kid in college, and I'm like, just finish and make your own money. You know what I mean? And he's working, and then all of a sudden, after his master's degree, he's in a rainstorm, and he's scared to death he's going to get hit by lightning, so he calls out, Saint Anne, save me, and I'll make myself a monk. And so, sure enough, he survives, and he's like, I got to be a monk. And he did. He gave his life to ministry at that point, becomes a Roman Catholic monk. His dad, by the way, from all accounts, is not happy. Not happy. But Martin Luther, even when he was young, all the way till he was an old man, trust me, he was an interesting character who said whatever he wanted to say, did whatever he wanted to do. He didn't care what anybody thought. The only person that you can see throughout Luther's life and history that he actually cared their thoughts was his beloved wife. And they had a really interesting, weird, and cool relationship. But the way he married her is he went to a nunnery, and he picked out a nun who was still Catholic and said, come with me, you're going to marry me. So he literally stole a nun and married her. The dude's very interesting. Again, there's stuff I can't say that he did. And he would draw cartoons, like funny paper cartoons of the Pope. It was bad. He did all sorts of interesting stuff. Anyway, nonetheless. So he was not a Christian at this point. 15 days later, he left law school and entered an Augustinian monastery. And at the age of 26, Luther, this is fascinating, was sent to Rome. There in Rome, his life forever changes. He doesn't get converted, not yet. But in Rome, he witnessed the moral condition of the papacy, the corruption of the priesthood, and the pointlessness of self-flagellation. Self-flagellation had become in vogue at this point. It was one of the most famous self-flagellation is a whip with 9 different strands that represented the cat of 9 tails. And serious religious people at the time would take off their shirt and they would whip themselves bloody to understand what it was to feel the pain of Jesus. They had clamps that they would put around their calves and their thighs underneath their robes, clamps with nails in them. And they would clamp it down, and then they would tie it tighter and tighter with a leather belt because they wanted to feel the pain all day long so that they could understand the life of Jesus. See, here's the problem. The gospel says that he suffered the pain so that you would not have to. Yes, it's true. James says that we all go through trials and temptations and suffering, and that's part of the life we live. But those are sent by God for his purposes, not self-flagellation. And that was very popular, like I said, during the time. And he was big into it from his own stories. I put here the story of the Scala Santa steps. In Rome, these steps are very famous. They're there to this day. And it was said, it's been proven it's not true, but it was said by the church that they had taken these steps from Jerusalem and they had moved them to Rome. And these are the same steps that Jesus would go up. And so what was tradition is for people to crawl up these steps. You couldn't walk. You crawled up these steps on your hands and knees. And the goal was to be as bloody as you could on your knees by the time you got up there. There are parts of the world right now that in the RC, they actually encourage this still. Like in Asia, you see this in parts of Asia, in the Philippines, where they're crucifying themselves. Yeah, brother, right? Crucifying themselves. And now they take themselves off the cross, but during Easter for like a week, they're up there. Jesus was crucified for you. But again, this idea of I need to suffer along with Jesus, very foolish. Anyway, he's crawling up these steps. And the story goes that as he's crawling up these steps, he's like, this is so stupid. What is it? What am I doing? Like, nobody takes this seriously. The Pope has like 12 concubines up there, and I'm down here on my knees, bloody. I'm done. And he stands up in the middle of the steps and was done. Now, he wasn't converted at that moment. It's said that he goes back to the University of Wittenberg, and in Wittenberg is where he was a professor. And he was deeply influenced by the writings of Huss, deeply influenced by, which it was influenced obviously by Wycliffe. And he's studying all of these folks, studying all these guys. And anyway, he studied there in Wittenberg for the next 5 years, from 1512 to 1517. Lastly, and we're done. Martin Luther and the 95 problems. Luther had 95 problems, and the Pope ate one. You know what I mean? This is flee the world and earn salvation. Extreme fasting, chastity, freezing quarters, and self-harm led to deep depression and a sense of total lostness. This is what Martin Luther was going through. All of this terrible stuff that he was going through. He was in deep depression. And in 1517, Luther, at the age of 35, alone in his office, was studying Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, where he read, "The just shall live by faith." And all of a sudden, he awoke. He woke up. I see this in the eyes of people when they get saved. You can see the life coming in. And he woke up to the realization, the just live by faith, not by works. My life is by faith, not by works. And the whole thing changed his life. He was born again. Suddenly, he understood the good news of the gospel and was born again. His eyes were opened and he saw everything as if for the very first time. At the same time, Tetzel was on a road show in Wittenberg. Now, this is just divine humor. While he is in his office studying, Tetzel himself, and I don't want to paint it as if he was like right outside, but he was there during the same time period, like within days or weeks. Tetzel comes through his town in Wittenberg, and Tetzel is out there preaching about the coin in the coffer rings. He's watching all of these poor individuals who are also hurting themselves and giving to the... And he just saw the corruption, and he loses his mind. Actually gains his mind. So he spends the next few days writing the 95 propositions that undermine the theology of and reality of indulgences. Once finished, he takes those 95 problems and he nails them to the castle door for public viewing. When he does this, by the way, this was not uncommon. This would have been like the modern billboard. This would have been where people posted, "Hey, come to my my potluck. Come to my party." And this is what he put. Very important. He wasn't attempting to destroy the RC Church. Remember, his goal was not to destroy the Roman Catholic Church. He was simply attempting to protest bad practices and perhaps bring about some reform. He was there to protest and bring reform. And this is what leads to the Protest Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. Now, this document is interesting. We'll talk about it next week because it gets taken down and printed and printed and printed and printed and printed on a new invention called the movable type printing press. And because technology and theology were now about to converge, we see the beginnings of a Reformation that could not be stopped. So that's where we're going to arrive next week, the Protestant Reformation. We'll pick up in Luther's story, and then we'll introduce you to all of the other reformers that lead us to the modern era. Part 7 next week. Any questions? John. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, he said the Shiites do the same thing. Yeah, unfortunately, you'll find this to be the case in a lot of religious practices. It's not a Christian doctrine. Yeah. You'll find this in Hinduism as an example. You find it in all sorts of religious practices.